Welcome to the Meteorology Matters podcast. For many of us, it really feels like the world's weather is just getting more and more, dynamic, unpredictable even, doesn't it?
It really does. We're seeing these extremes everywhere.
Exactly. Severe floods, just devastating communities, and then these intense heat waves that are shattering records left and right. Plus, powerful storms causing such widespread destruction.
Yeah, it's a lot. And understanding it, preparing for it, it feels less like an option and more like, well, a necessity now.
Absolutely critical for our lives right now. And that really brings us to today's topic.
Right. Because today we're going to take a closer look, sort of pull back the curtain on some recent shifts in federal policy and funding. And these are shifts that directly touch on environmental protection, climate science, and crucially, our nation's disaster response capabilities.
So our mission today is really to unpack the details of these policy changes. We want to explore what they could actually mean in the real world for everyone listening, and consider how these shifts might ripple through our ability to understand, predict, and ultimately respond to the weather challenges we're all facing.
It's definitely a story of interconnected systems.
Yeah.
And some very deliberate shifts happening right now.
So where should we start? Maybe with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. There's been talk about a really fundamental shift in its foundation.
Well, let's start there, because just recently, actually, on Friday, July 18th, 2025, the EPA made this huge announcement. It really sent shockwaves through the scientific community.
Okay, what was it?
They announced they would be eliminating their core scientific research arm, the Office of Research and Development.
Eliminating it entirely. Wow, that sounds significant.
It is. And we're not talking about just, a simple reorganization or shuffling things around. This involves the planned firing of hundreds of highly specialized scientists.
Hundreds. What kind of scientists are we talking about?
Oh, chemists, biologists, toxicologists. The very people whose research forms the basis for so much of what the EPA does. It's effectively, gutting a critical part of the agency.
That's an enormous loss. Just the institutional knowledge, the expertise. Is this something happening just within the EPA, or is it part of a bigger picture?
It definitely seems to fit into a larger pattern. This action aligns pretty clearly with the significant push we're seeing from the current administration to, reduce the size of the federal workforce and, frankly, dismantle parts of various federal agencies.
Right. I've heard about that push.
And this whole initiative got a major boost, legally speaking, from a Supreme Court ruling. That ruling basically allowed these plans to move forward, even though there were ongoing legal challenges trying to stop them. And it's worth noting that government scientists specifically seem to have been particular targets in these workforce reductions across the board.
So this isn't just about the EPA then. It's wider. Okay, can you elaborate a bit on what this specific office, the Office of Research and Development, actually did? What was its role? Why is losing it such a big deal?
Well, for decades, this office, the ORD, performed a really crucial function. It provided the independent scientific research, the bedrock, really, for almost all of the EPA's policies and regulations.
Independent being the key word there, I imagine.
Exactly. Think about it. Without solid, independent scientific data, how can an agency effectively identify environmental risks? How can it set protective standards that actually hold up? Or even defend its regulations if they get challenged in court?
Right. It's the foundation.
It really was.
Yeah.
This office acted as the agency's sort of scientific compass, making sure policy decisions were grounded in objective evidence, not just, political winds or industry pressure.
So taking it away doesn't just cut research jobs.
No, it fundamentally shifts the balance. It potentially opens the door for policy goals or political considerations to come before the independent science. That's the big concern.
That distinction is huge. Can you give us some concrete examples? What kind of work did this office do that, impacts our daily lives?
Absolutely. For instance, the ORD was responsible for really critical analyses, like figuring out the risks posed by hazardous chemicals. Stuff that might be in our air, our water, maybe even products we use every day.
Okay, like chemical safety assessments. What else?
They also did essential research on the health impacts of wildfire smoke. That's become tragically relevant for so many communities across the country recently, hasn't it?
Definitely. It feels like it affects more people every year.
And their work also extended to investigating drinking water contamination, especially looking at issues related to practices like hydraulic fracturing or fracking.
Right. And I imagine their findings weren't always popular with everyone.
Well, that's the crucial part. This independent research often provided the scientific justification for stricter environmental rules. And as you can imagine, that frequently led to significant pushback from, say, chemical manufacturers or other industries whose operations would be directly impacted by tougher regulations. So there was this inherent tension.
So their independent science pointed towards needing more protection, which put them at odds with industries wanting less regulation. Okay, that certainly adds context. What are the numbers? How many people are we talking about losing, both in this science office and maybe across the EPA as a whole?
The numbers really paint a stark picture. When President Trump first took office, this science office, the ORD, had about 1,155 employees.
Okay, over 1,000.
Right. But since January 2025 alone, over 325 of those workers have already left. They accepted these deferred resignation offers.
What does that mean, deferred resignation?
It's essentially an incentive package to get employees to leave voluntarily. They get some benefits, maybe, but they agree to leave before facing a potential forced layoff. It lets the administration reduce staff numbers more quietly without initiating a big, formal reduction in force, RAF, right away.
So it's a way to shrink the office without a mass firing event yet.
Exactly. But the uncertainty for the roughly 830 employees still remaining is incredibly high. Their future, their jobs are very much up in the air right now.
So hundreds gone already, hundreds more just waiting. What about the EPA overall? Has the whole agency seen similar cuts?
Yes, looking agency-wide, the picture is similar. The EPA started with around 16,155 employees under the Trump administration.
16,000.
But now over 3,700 employees have either left or are slated to leave through these offers, firings, retirements, regular resignations, you name it.
Wow, over 3,700.
Yeah, so that brings the agency's total workforce down to about 12,448 people. That's a staffing level we haven't seen since, believe it or not, the Reagan administration back in the 80s.
The Reagan administration, that's a massive rollback in federal capacity. Just huge. How are people reacting? What are the union's former officials saying about gutting the science arm like this?
The reaction has been, well, pretty strong. Concern, condemnation, particularly from the unions representing EPA workers. The American Federation of Government Employees, Council 238, they represent over 8,000 EPA workers. They strongly condemned Friday's announcement.
What did they say?
Justin Chen, he's the president of that council, put it very powerfully. He said the science office is the heart and brain of the EPA.
The heart and brain. Wow.
Yeah, and he added, without it, we don't have the means to assess impacts upon human health and the environment. Its destruction will devastate public health in our country. That's a pretty dire warning about the potential long-term consequences for public health, for environmental safety.
Devastate public health. That really frames the gravity of these cuts. What about former high-ranking officials, people who used to run things there?
Jennifer Orme-Zavaleta offered some really sharp criticism. And she's someone with deep experience, worked at the EPA for 40 years, even led this very research office, the ORD, during the first Trump administration.
Okay, so she knows it inside out. What did she say?
She called these actions dismantling a world-class organization. And she stated very clearly, the American people are not going to be well served by this. She also described the actions as very short-sighted and added, the way they're going about it is very callous and very cruel.
Strong words. Did she raise other concerns?
Yes. She and other experts are also warning about this plan to potentially move some of the remaining science functions into a new department, one that's directly within the EPA administrator's office.
What's the worry there?
The concern is that it threatens to politicize the scientific research. By bringing it under direct administrative control, you risk compromising its independence, its integrity. The science might start to follow the policy instead of informing it.
So it's not just the cuts themselves, but how the remaining science might be structured and potentially influenced. Okay, so what's the administration's side of this? What's their rationale for making these drastic changes?
Well, Administrator Lee Zeldin has been quite public about it. He's consistently highlighted the fact that they've cut dozens of environmental regulations. He frames these actions as making it, quote, cheaper and easier for industries to operate.
So reducing burdens on industry is a key goal.
That seems to be the main justification. The EPA has also claimed significant financial savings from all this. They're saying they've saved $748.8 million through what they call organizational improvements and these staff reductions. Administrator Zeldin has publicly emphasized a commitment to being responsible stewards of your hard-earned tax dollars.
Right. So framing it as fiscal prudence, efficiency, helping the economy by cutting red tape, How are industry groups and maybe conservative think tanks reacting? Are they backing these moves?
Well, there's definitely significant support from those corners. Chris John, he's president of the American Chemistry Council. That's a major chemical industry lobbying group. He stated his organization, quote, supports EPA, evaluating its resources to ensure American taxpayer dollars are being used efficiently and effectively. That aligns pretty neatly with the long-standing industry desire for, well, less stringent regulation.
Makes sense from their perspective. What about think tanks?
Conservative research organizations have also been very vocal. The Heritage Foundation, for example, in their Project 2025 blueprint, which is this huge detailed plan for how a new administration could overhaul the entire federal government. They had specifically criticized the EPA Science Office.
What did they say was wrong with it?
They accused the office of being, and I'm quoting here, bloated, unaccountable, closed, outcome-driven, hostile to public and legislative input, and inclined to pursue political rather than purely scientific goals. So a fundamental disagreement with how that office operated before.
That's quite an indictment. Were there other groups calling for these kinds of cuts, maybe targeting specific programs?
Yes, definitely. The Competitive Enterprise Institute, another conservative research organization, specifically called for getting rid of or completely overhauling the Integrated Risk Information System that's known as IRIS.
And what does IRIS do?
It's a really crucial program that evaluates the toxicity of chemicals. James Brokel, who used to be with CEI and is now with the America First Policy Institute, a group closely aligned with the Trump administration, he argued that these IRIS evaluations often rely on worst-case hazard assumptions that fail to consider real-world exposure scenarios.
So the argument is that the evaluations are too strict, not realistic enough.
Essentially, yes. It suggests a desire for evaluations that might be seen as less burdensome to industries that produce or use those chemicals. It fits right into that broader deregulatory agenda we've been talking about.
Okay. And how was this all communicated internally? How did the staff find out their research arm was being eliminated?
Well, the confirmation actually came through an email sent out on a Friday evening. It was from Maureen Gwynn, the acting head of the office.
Friday evening. That's rough timing.
Yeah. Her message acknowledged the, quote, uncertainty and concern among the staff. She urged them to remember to take care of yourselves, and she announced an upcoming town hall meeting for staff to discuss these sweeping changes. It just highlights the significant human impact, the emotional toll these decisions are taking on the people involved.
Absolutely. An incredibly difficult time for those scientists and employees. Wow. Okay, this leads us almost directly to another major policy shift, doesn't it? One that could have even broader implications for how the country deals with climate change.
Yes, absolutely. Let's pivot to that now, the really high-stakes battle over climate regulation, specifically focusing on the future of what's known as the Endangerment Finding.
Right, the Endangerment Finding. That sounds like a technical legal term, but my understanding is its implications are massive. What would it actually mean if it were repealed?
You're right, the implications would be huge, incredibly far-reaching. If this proposal from the EPA announced just recently, Tuesday, July 29th, 2025, if it's finalized, it would effectively wipe out all EPA regulations on greenhouse gases from cars. Those rules exist because of this finding.
Just cars? Or does it go further?
Oh, it goes much further. It would also seriously undermine the existing rules that limit emissions from power plants and the rules controlling methane release from oil and gas operations.
So it basically dismantles the EPA's main tool for regulating climate pollution.
Exactly it. It gets rid of the core legal authority the EPA has used for over a decade to regulate the pollutants warming the planet.
And Administrator Zeldin himself called this, what was it? The largest deregulatory action in the history of the United States.
He did. He stated, "We do not have that power on our own to decide as an agency that we're going to combat global climate change because we give ourselves that power." He framed it as reining in agency overreach, while still claiming his aim is to balance economic growth with environmental protection and committing to clean air and water.
So from the administration's view, it's about limiting agency power, prioritizing the economy.
And that really cuts to the heart of this whole debate, because that 2009 endangerment finding wasn't just some arbitrary decision. It was a formal conclusion by the EPA based on science.
What did it conclude exactly?
It determined, scientifically and legally, that greenhouse gases, CO2 being the main one, pose a real threat to public health and welfare. And that conclusion was absolutely crucial.
Why was it so critical?
Because it established the legal basis for the EPA to regulate those gases as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. The new proposal directly challenges that. It essentially argues the Clean Air Act doesn't give the EPA that specific power to regulate greenhouse gases for climate purposes.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a direct challenge, not just to the regulation, but to the underlying science and the legal framework itself. What are the critics saying, people who disagree with this repeal?
Well, Zeeland Hoover, who was a senior advisor at the EPA under President Biden, didn't mince words. He called the move not just an attack on science, but on common sense.
Common sense. How so?
He pointed directly to the National Climate Assessment. That's this massive, comprehensive report, over 2,000 pages, detailing all the evidence of climate change harms happening right here in the U.S. Hoover urged people to think about the millions of Americans who have lost their homes and livelihoods to extreme fires, floods, and storms that are only getting worse. He's making that direct link between the science, the finding, and the real-world suffering people are experiencing.
That's a powerful connection, linking the policy directly to people's lived experiences, the devastation from these extreme weather events. What about the industries most affected, like automakers? What's their take?
The Alliance for Automotive Innovation, they're a big trade group representing most U.S. automakers. They said they're still studying the proposal. But their president, John Bozzella, indicated they broadly support changing the policy.
Why? What's their reasoning?
He argued that the vehicle emissions rules finalized under the previous administration simply aren't achievable given today's market conditions and technology. He thinks the rules need to be revised to reflect reality, keep the industry competitive, allow for consumer choice, but still aim for lower emissions overall. So for them, it's about recalibrating regulations they see as too strict, too costly right now.
Okay, that definitely aligns with the broader economic arguments we heard earlier about regulatory burdens. What are the conservative think tanks saying specifically about this endangerment finding?
The endangerment finding has been a major target for many conservatives and libertarians for years. They see these climate regulations as incredibly expensive and a classic example of federal overreach.
Right.
Diana Furchtgott-Roth over at the Heritage Foundation Center for Energy, Climate, and the Environment called it a very expensive regulation. She argued it leads to rules that raise the cost of energy and raise the cost of transportation, and that these costs disproportionately burden the poor, burden farmers, and burden small businesses.
So focusing on the economic costs, particularly for certain groups. Anyone else?
Yeah, Myron Ebel, he's chairman of the American Lands Council and was actually on the EPA transition team earlier. He went even further. He said repealing this finding is crucial for cementing the current administration's energy legacy. Why? Because it makes it much harder for a future Democratic administration or a Green Republican president to undo these deregulatory changes.
Ah, so it's strategic. It's not just about the present, but about locking in a policy direction for the long term, making it harder to reverse course later.
Exactly. It's about limiting future options for climate action through this particular legal avenue.
This brings up that whole cost-benefit debate again. We've heard these regulations cost trillions, but then others say the benefits are worth trillions. Can you unpack that a bit? How can the numbers be so different?
It really comes down to what you count. The EPA, under Administrator Zeldin, has put out figures suggesting vehicle regulations tied to the finding cost over $1 trillion.
$1 trillion, that's a huge number.
It is. But critics jump in immediately and say that estimate is fundamentally flawed because it completely ignores the benefits of avoiding those emissions.
What kind of benefits are they talking about?
Things like fewer premature deaths because of cleaner air, fewer hospital visits for asthma, heart problems, respiratory illnesses, lower healthcare costs overall. Under the Biden administration, the EPA actually estimated that these health and environmental benefits would outweigh the costs by about $1 trillion through 2055. So it's a massive disagreement based on whether you factor in the societal benefits of cleaner air and a more stable climate, or just focus on the direct compliance costs for industry.
$1 trillion in costs versus $1 trillion in net benefits. That's a staggering difference in perspective. Okay, let's talk legal ground. This 2009 finding didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? There was a Supreme Court case involved.
Absolutely. That's critical context. Back in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled in a landmark case called Massachusetts v. EPA. In that case, the court explicitly said the EPA did have the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
So the court already said they could do it.
Yes. That ruling directly paved the way for the 2009 endangerment finding and all the carbon limits that followed. That's why legal experts are calling the current administration's strategy of going directly after the finding itself a really risky legal move.
Risky how?
Richard Reves, he's a law professor at NYU, described it as trying to get the holy grail, getting rid of the whole climate regulation framework in one fell swoop instead of chipping away at individual rules. But, he warned, if you lose, you end up empty-handed. It's an all-or-nothing legal gamble.
A high-stakes bet. But the Supreme Court looks very different now than it did in 2007. Is that part of the calculation here?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's almost certainly a huge factor in the strategy. Kenny Stein, from the Institute for Energy Research, that's a conservative group, he argued that the original Massachusetts v. EPA ruling was based on shaky legal argument anyway, and he believes it's been undermined by more recent Supreme Court decisions.
Like which ones?
He pointed to a 2022 ruling that emphasized agencies need explicit permission from Congress for major new powers, especially ones with big economic consequences, like regulating greenhouse gases. Stein thinks that given the massive change in the complexion of the Supreme Court, the original Massachusetts decision would likely be overruled pretty comprehensively if a similar case reached the court today.
So they're banking on this current court being much more receptive to their argument that the EPA overstepped its authority.
That seems to be the calculation, yes. A belief that the legal ground has shifted significantly in their favor.
Okay, so what happens next with this proposal? Is it a done deal?
Not yet. The EPA's proposal now goes into a mandatory 45-day public comment period. Anyone can submit comments, individuals, organizations, companies. After that period closes, the EPA is legally required to review and respond to those comments before they can issue a final rule.
And has the administrator encouraged public input?
Yes, Administrator Zeldin explicitly invited public comments on rescinding both the endangerment finding itself and all the related greenhouse gas rules for vehicles. They're clearly looking for public support to bolster their case for this change.
Okay, so let's game this out. What happens if this repeal actually goes through, if it survives the comment period and potential court challenges? What are the ripple effects, say, for electric vehicles or just future climate policy?
The potential consequences are pretty significant. Richard Reves, the NYU law professor, anticipates we'd see a marked slowdown in investment in electric vehicle technology. Maybe not overnight, but if that primary regulatory pressure pushing automakers towards EVs is removed or weakened, the pace of innovation and investment could definitely slow.
Less incentive to invest in EVs. What about legal challenges? Are environmental groups going to fight this?
Oh, absolutely. David Donecker, a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, in RDC, has already vowed they will challenge the repeal. They plan to submit extensive comments, and if the rule is finalized, they intend to take the EPA to court.
On what grounds?
Donecker argues the Clean Air Act unambiguously does include greenhouse gases as air pollutants that harm public health. He insists the law limits regulation to science and health issues, not broad economic policy decisions. He predicts pretty firmly that the EPA will ultimately lose in court.
But even if they eventually lose in court, could there be damage done in the meantime while the legal fight plays out?
That's a really critical point Donecker raises. He warns about significant long-term impacts even if the repeal doesn't ultimately stand up legally. The whole process, proposing it, fighting it in court, could take years. And during that time of regulatory uncertainty, he fears it could put another generation of dirty cars on the road because automakers might delay shifting to cleaner vehicles.
So years of potentially higher emissions while the courts decide.
Exactly. And if, against the odds, the repeal does survive the court challenges, then future administrations would effectively be blocked from using the Clean Air Act, arguably the most powerful existing environmental law to tackle climate change. That tool would be gone.
That's huge.
Donecker summed it up powerfully. He said this move essentially asks the American people who are living through wildfires, floods, hurricanes, heat domes, and so on, not to believe what they're going through, not to believe their own eyes. He thinks it will seem mind-bogglingly false and out of touch given what people are experiencing with extreme weather.
Wow. That's a sobering perspective. A high-stakes legal and policy fight with incredibly direct, real-world consequences for the environment, for the climate, for all of us. And this ties directly into our next big topic, doesn't it? Because who responds when these climate-related disasters strike? That brings us to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Right. And the landscape there is also shifting dramatically, especially as we head into what meteorologists are warning could be a very active hurricane season.
What's the forecast looking like?
Well, the experts are predicting an above-normal season. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, they're forecasting somewhere between 13 to 19 named storms in the Atlantic, and importantly, they expect 3 to 5 of those could become major hurricanes.
3 to 5 major hurricanes. That's significant potential for damage.
It is, and Laura Grimm, who's the acting head at NOAA, made a key point. She highlighted that hurricane impacts aren't just coastal anymore. We saw it last year with Hurricanes Helene and Debbie. Significant inland flooding can reach far beyond the coast, affecting communities that might not typically think of themselves as being in hurricane territory.
So, a potentially severe season with widespread risk. But at the same time, there's this cloud of uncertainty hanging over FEMA's role, right?
Right.
What's causing that?
Yet, despite the series forecast, there's this palpable uncertainty because the administration is sending very mixed, shifting signals about what the federal government's role in disaster response should even be.
Mixed signals how?
Well, on one hand, the administration says it remains, quote, laser focused on disaster response and protecting the American people. But on the other hand, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, has publicly argued that FEMA, as it's currently structured, is inefficient.
Inefficient. What's her vision for it?
She argues it should take more of a supportive role, with states taking the clear lead. She actually said, federal emergency management should be state and locally led rather than how it has operated for decades. And she even suggested this entire agency needs to be eliminated as it exists today and remade into a responsive agency.
Eliminated as it exists today. Wow, that's a fundamental challenge to how disaster response has worked for decades, especially heading into hurricane season.
It's a huge philosophical shift being proposed.
How has this rhetoric, this proposed shift, actually played out in recent disasters? And how are states reacting on the ground?
Well, interestingly, the rhetoric from administration officials seemed to soften a bit, shifting more towards reforming FEMA rather than eliminating it entirely after those devastating floods hit Texas earlier this month.
What happened there?
Secretary Noem faced a lot of public criticism over reports of a botched federal response to the Texas floods. The Houston Chronicle's editorial board even compared it to the failures during Hurricane Katrina, suggesting serious problems with federal coordination and aid delivery.
That's a damning comparison. How bad were the floods?
They were incredibly severe. At least 120 people died. Over 100 were still missing last we heard. And the early cost estimates are huge, somewhere between $18 billion and $22 billion.
That's devastating. But the administration defended the response.
Yes. Despite the widespread criticism, President Trump publicly praised Secretary Noem's handling of the situation and dismissed reports that her funding decisions had actually slowed down the federal response efforts.
So states are getting these mixed messages, seeing criticism of federal response. They must be feeling pretty uncertain about what support they can actually count on. How are they preparing?
They really are grappling with this uncertainty. States across the political spectrum, red and blue. Louisiana's Governor Jeff Landry, a Republican, was very frank. He basically admitted he doesn't know what added responsibilities his state might suddenly face under a new federal approach.
So they're trying to figure it out on their own.
Some are trying to be proactive. A handful of states have set up special task forces or commissions to strategize. For example, in Georgia, a bipartisan group of state lawmakers created a study committee specifically focused on disaster mitigation. That shows concern across party lines.
Interesting. Any other examples?
Kentucky state legislature actually passed a law creating a task force just to prepare for potential changes in FEMA funding and structure. The Republican state senator who co-sponsored that bill, Matthew Deneen, stressed that the state needs to be agile, to be responsive, and to be prepared, given how unpredictable the federal situation feels right now.
So states are definitely trying to brace themselves. What is FEMA itself saying? What's the official line from the agency about their role this season?
Well, a spokesperson for FEMA pushed back on the idea of uncertainty. They stated there is no uncertainty about what FEMA will be doing this hurricane season. And they added, the old processes are being replaced because they failed Americans in real emergencies for decades.
So their line is that these changes aren't weakening response. They're actually improving it by fixing past failures.
That seems to be the official position. They're framing the changes as necessary improvements, despite all the external concerns about reduced federal capacity and support.
But these kinds of fundamental changes, shifting responsibility to states, that must have huge financial implications, right? Especially for states whose budgets are already stretched thin.
That's a critical point, and it's where you really see the connections between these different policy shifts. States are already facing enormous budget pressures. Federal lawmakers have been cutting spending across the board: healthcare, infrastructure, and yes, natural disasters.
And there was a specific FEMA program cut recently that hit disaster preparedness funding hard, wasn't there?
Yes, a major one. Back in April, FEMA suspended its Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program known as BRIC. That single cut eliminated $882 million in federal funding.
$882 million. What did the BRIC program actually do?
It was specifically designed to help communities reduce their long-term hazard risks before a disaster strikes. It gave economic support to states so they could invest in things like strengthening infrastructure, improving building codes, flood mitigation projects, proactive measures. Losing it removes a crucial source of funding for prevention.
That sounds exactly like the kind of program needed to build resilience and probably save money in the long run by avoiding future damage. How did states react to losing BRIC?
The reaction was pretty strong. 20 states actually sued FEMA over it. They alleged the agency unlawfully terminated grants that Congress had already approved.
What was their argument in the lawsuit?
They emphasized that many important projects that had been in development for years, designed specifically to prevent devastating damage, are now just left unfinished or paused indefinitely, leaving communities more vulnerable.
How did FEMA defend the cut?
An agency spokesperson defended the decision by calling BRIC a wasteful and ineffective FEMA program. And they added a comment noting that two-thirds of the counties that had received grants under the program had voted for Trump in 2024.
Wait, they brought voting patterns into it.
He did, which, introduced a pretty clear political dimension into the justification for suspending a disaster resilience program. It suggested that political alignment might have factored into how the program's effectiveness was judged.
That definitely adds another layer. Okay, so states are losing proactive funding, like BRIC. What's the broader financial impact, especially when you combine these cuts with other federal changes happening?
Colin Ford, who directs the Fiscal Risk Project at the Pew Charitable Trusts, put it very clearly. He said these moves are compounding the pressures already hitting state budgets. States were already struggling with the rising costs of disasters, and traditional budgeting methods were beginning to fall short, even before these new federal cuts.
So, if states now have to spend more on disaster prep themselves,
it inevitably comes at the cost of trade-offs in other policy areas, as Ford warned. If more state money has to go to disaster readiness or recovery, it might mean less money for schools, roads, public safety, other essential services. It forces really difficult choices, a kind of zero-sum game for state budgets.
and it's not just disaster funding cuts creating pressure, right? You mentioned healthcare earlier. How does that fit in?
Absolutely. It compounds the problem significantly. Think about broader federal cuts, particularly to Medicaid services. There are projections, for instance, that around 16 million Americans could lose their health insurance by 2034 under policies being discussed or implemented.
16 million.
Yeah. And that likely forces states to pick up a much bigger share of the rising medical costs for their residents. Representative Jared Moskowitz, he's a Democrat from Florida, used to be the state's emergency management director. He painted a really stark picture.
What did he predict?
He grimly predicted that if states lose FEMA reimbursement for disasters, on top of the hole they just blew in their healthcare budget because of the lack of federal funding, then there are states that are just a ticking time bomb. It highlights this potential cascade of financial crises hitting states from multiple directions at once.
A ticking time bomb. That's a terrifying image, that confluence of pressures. So given this potential gap, what are the practical solutions? How can states bridge this disaster preparedness funding issue if the federal money isn't there like it used to be?
Well, experts like Matthew Sanders, also at Pew, emphasize that states absolutely need to increase their own spending on long-term risk reduction. Because, as he says, it's always cheaper to reduce risk, to avoid risk, than it is to recover from a disaster. That's just fundamental.
Cheaper to prevent than repair? Makes sense.
But, and this is the huge but, he underscored that historically the federal government has been the predominant funder for these kinds of proactive, large-scale resilience projects. So if there are major federal shortfalls, it creates a gap that's going to need to be filled from other sources. And states are left scrambling to find those sources, often by cutting elsewhere.
Are we seeing states already trying to adapt, trying to find ways to cope with this new reality?
Yes, some states are definitely trying to be proactive, despite the challenges. For example, after Hurricane Helene hit hard last fall, Georgia recommended updates to its building codes and created a reforestation tax credit, both aimed at long-term resilience. That tax credit was signed into law back in May.
So policy changes at the state level. What else?
Emergency management agencies in places like North Carolina and South Carolina are actively exploring more collaborations with the private sector. They're also trying to build stronger connections with other state emergency management groups to share resources, expertise, best practices.
Trying to pool resources.
Right. The spokesperson for North Carolina's governor, Josh Stein, stated pretty bluntly that eliminating FEMA entirely would be a man-made disaster. They urged for working together to improve the agency, not dismantle it. And interestingly, in South Dakota, the Republican Lieutenant Governor, Tony Venhausen, is leading a state task force specifically created to prepare for potential changes at FEMA. He expressed sympathy for federal spending issues, but stressed they desperately need details on what the cuts actually mean for their state's responsibilities.
So states are trying to adapt, trying to collaborate, trying to plan. But they're clearly facing a real uphill battle without that consistent federal funding and clear guidance. You know, all these discussions, the EPA changes, the FEMA uncertainty, the disaster response capacity, they all ultimately tie back to our fundamental understanding of climate and weather itself.
Exactly. Which brings us to our next section concerning what feels like a retreat from climate monitoring itself. Specifically, the proposed closure of the iconic Mauna Loa Observatory.
This sounds really serious, what's being proposed.
It is quite significant. President Trump's proposed budget for 2026 explicitly targets the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii for closure. But it goes further. It also aims to eliminate almost all climate research currently done by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA.
Almost all of NOAA's climate research.
That's what the proposal indicates. It includes defunding many other climate labs and essentially dismantling the entire U.S. government's network for monitoring greenhouse gases.
Mauna Loa. That name is so familiar in climate discussions. What makes that specific observatory so important? Why is it considered such a unique, almost perfect spot?
Mauna Loa sits way up high, over 11,100 feet above sea level on a Hawaiian volcano. It's this stark landscape. Black rocks, white clouds, blue sky. Its isolation and altitude are key. It samples air that's largely undisturbed by local pollution or vegetation effects.
So it gets a really clean air sample.
Exactly. It makes it one of the absolute best places on the entire planet for accurately measuring atmospheric greenhouse gases over the long term. It's considered indispensable by scientists worldwide because the data is so consistent, so pure, and stretches back so far. It's like having this perfectly calibrated sensor in the cleanest possible global air mass.
And this is where the famous Keeling curve comes from, right? Can you remind us about that graph and why it's so iconic?
That's right. The Keeling curve, known the world over, originated from continuous CO2 readings collected right there at Mauna Loa starting way back in 1958 by Charles David Keeling. It's that simple but powerful upward swooping line you see everywhere.
What does it show?
It vividly charts the steady, undeniable, and frankly accelerating rise of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere over the past 7 decades. And it directly links that rise to nations burning ever more oil, gas, and coal.
What are the actual numbers?
When Keeling started in 1958, the CO2 concentration was about 316 parts per million. Now, it's over 430 parts per million. Just in 2024, the average was 424.61 ppm.
That's a huge increase.
It is. And Lisa Gromlich, an emeritus climate scientist, pointed out something profound. She said that data from Mauna Loa provided the definitive, undeniable proof that humans were capable of changing the entire planet's climate. It made it so clear that we were moving beyond natural variability and that fossil fuel burning was causing it. It was basically the smoking gun for human-caused climate change.
So this one remote spot gave us the answer to one of the biggest questions of our time. What are scientists saying now about the proposal to just shut it down and defund all this monitoring?
Lisa Gromlich called the closure proposal frankly inconceivable. She highlighted that while a lot of climate science is complex, this iconic Keeling curve record is something that can be grasped by almost anyone. It's a clear visual. She asked, why, for relatively little cost, would we want to lose that ability?
Good question. What about former agency heads?
Rick Spinrad, who led NOAA during the Biden administration, used a great analogy. He said consistent climate records are like regular doctor checkups for the planet. You wouldn't just stop going to the doctor if you wanted to stay healthy, right? He argued we shouldn't stop monitoring the planet if we want to understand and address its changing health.
That makes sense. But Mauna Loa isn't working completely alone, is it? Is it part of a bigger network that's also threatened by these cuts?
Yes, that's a really important point. Mauna Loa is a crucial piece, but it's part of a much larger, globally significant network run by NOAA.
What other sites are involved?
NOAA operates 3 other key long-term monitoring stations, one up in Barrow, Alaska, one in American Samoa in the South Pacific, and one right at the geographic South Pole in Antarctica.
So covering the globe from north to south.
Exactly. These four stations working together are what allow scientists to calculate the global average carbon dioxide trend. They give us that comprehensive planetary overview. The proposed budget wouldn't just close Mauna Loa, it would close all four.
All four. What would that mean?
It means the United States would lose its unique pole-to-pole view of greenhouse gases. It's a consistent long-term network that other countries simply can't replicate easily or quickly. It would create a massive gap in our global understanding.
A huge data gap. And how do they collect samples beyond these main stations? I think I heard something about a flask network.
Yes, NOAA also runs a vital flask network. They collect air samples in literal flasks from remote locations all around the world, mountains, islands, ships.
And where do those samples go?
They get sent back and meticulously analyzed at NOAA's Global Monitoring Lab in Boulder, Colorado. And guess what? That central lab in Boulder is also targeted by these proposed budget cuts.
So the whole system is under threat. Are there other networks doing this?
There are other air sampling networks around the world, run by different countries or institutions, but frankly, none have the same comprehensive coverage, the long-term consistency, or the sheer volume and quality of data provided by NOAA's network. It's really a cornerstone of global monitoring, providing critical ground truth data that everyone relies on.
And presumably, they're tracking more than just CO2 at these sites. What else would we lose?
That's another crucial point. These observatories track a much wider range of atmospheric components than just carbon dioxide. They monitor methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas in the short term. They track nitrous oxide, aerosols, substances that deplete the ozone layer, soot, particulate pollution.
A whole suite of things.
Right. And even subtle changes in solar radiation, weather patterns, wind patterns. Collecting all this data together is what allows scientists to get a truly holistic, nuanced picture of our atmosphere's health and understand the complex factors driving climate change. Losing that comprehensive view would be a major setback.
Okay, so what are the real-world consequences then? If we lose all this data from Mauna Loa, from the whole NOAA network, what does that mean for us, practically speaking? Our ability to understand, predict, protect ourselves?
Rick Spinrad put it starkly. He said, without this data, we'd lose large areas of observation and make it harder to understand where greenhouse gases are coming from and where they're going. Just fundamentally harder to track the problem.
What does that mean for prediction?
It makes it exponentially harder to accurately assess long-term climate trends, harder to pinpoint the specific causes of the changes we're seeing, and crucially, harder to make better, more precise predictions for extreme weather events. Those devastating heat waves, droughts, floods we were talking about earlier.
So it affects disaster preparedness too.
Absolutely. It would hinder our ability to identify the places most vulnerable to climate impacts. It would make it harder to find promising locations for potential carbon dioxide removal projects. And maybe most importantly, harder to even verify if those kinds of efforts are actually working.
Right, you can't measure success if you stop measuring.
Exactly. Spinrad warned, it's not just the climate mission that gets compromised. It's the ability to protect people and property for things like wildfire. So much is lost with the elimination and termination of these labs. It directly impacts our ability to prepare for and mitigate future disasters.
That's incredibly alarming. It touches everything from basic science to protecting lives and property. What about the international picture? What message does shutting down this world-renowned monitoring send globally?
Ralph Keeling, he's a climate scientist at Scripps, and importantly, the son of Charles Keeling, who started the Mauna Loa curves. He emphasized that NOAA's monitoring effort is really the backbone of the global effort to track greenhouse gases.
The backbone.
Yeah. He stressed that scientists and governments all over the world rely heavily on the Keeling curve data and the broader NOAA network data to calibrate their own measurements and build reliable global climate models. Abandoning Mauna Loa, he said, would send yet another clear signal to the world that the United States is no longer serious about climate change.
That's a powerful statement, undermining U.S. scientific leadership and potentially global cooperation on climate.
It certainly risks doing that, especially when tackling climate change absolutely requires global collaboration and shared, trusted data.
It seems so incredibly clear listening to all this that these aren't just isolated decisions happening in different agencies. These proposed cuts and policy shifts at EPA, at FEMA, at NOAA, they feel deeply, maybe even dangerously interconnected.
That's the absolutely essential takeaway here. We need to connect the dots.
Okay, let's try. If you have regulatory reductions at the EPA aimed at making things cheaper and easier for industries,
then a direct and frankly predictable potential consequence is more environmental degradation. And critically for climate, potentially higher greenhouse gas emissions. If there's less oversight, less regulation, the incentive to pollute less is naturally diminished.
Right. And if industries are potentially emitting more, at the exact same time, the system's designed to precisely track those emissions. Mauna Loa, the whole NOAA network we just discussed, are being dismantled.
Exactly. It's this compounding effect. More pollution potentially going into the atmosphere and less ability to accurately measure and track it.
Hmm.
And a direct consequence of that could well be an acceleration, an exacerbation of climate change itself,
Which means?
which means potentially more frequent, more intense extreme weather events. More of those floods, hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires that communities across the country are already struggling with at an alarming rate. It really does risk creating a dangerous feedback loop.
Yeah.
Less regulation today potentially leading to more severe climate impacts tomorrow?
So we could have human activity, potentially less regulated, contributing more to these severe weather events,
Right.
which then naturally demand more intervention, more resources from disaster response agencies. But at the exact same time, the main federal disaster agency, FEMA, is facing budget cuts, and its whole operational model is being shifted to put more responsibility and more financial burden back onto the states.
And that combination creates a truly critical, potentially dangerous situation for American citizens. You could find people in a far more precarious position, less prepared, less supported, less able to adapt and survive the increasing frequency and intensity of these climate and weather-related disasters.
Especially with cuts to proactive programs like that BRIC program for resilience we talked about.
Exactly. Cutting proactive prevention further diminishes resilience right at the local level, just when it's needed most. It really does look like a deeply concerning potential feedback loop. The problem gets bigger, but the capacity to deal with it shrinks.
It absolutely sounds like a potential vicious cycle where the impacts intensify, but our collective ability to manage them is deliberately reduced. Of course, the administration and its supporters would frame this very differently.
Oh, absolutely. While critics are raising alarms about this vicious cycle, potentially hurting average Americans by increasing their vulnerability, the administration frames these changes entirely differently. They see them as necessary steps for boosting economic growth, ensuring fiscal responsibility by cutting federal spending, and streamlining what they view as bloated government.
So, getting rid of regulatory overreach that they believe stifled industry and burdened taxpayers.
Precisely. It's presented as ultimately benefiting the nation by unshackling the economy. It really comes down to a fundamental disagreement about how you weigh the costs and benefits, the economic costs of regulation versus the societal and environmental costs of not regulating or of reducing disaster preparedness.
Yeah.
Very different priorities.
Wow. It's clear these are incredibly complex issues with such profound and interconnected implications for every single one of us. Okay, let's try to recap briefly. We've talked about major changes at the Environmental Protection Agency, the elimination of its core science research arm, the proposed repeal of the Endangerment Finding, potentially reshaping environmental quality and climate regulation for years to come.
Right. And we explored the significant uncertainty now swirling around FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This is happening just as we face forecasts for an active hurricane season. And there are real concerns about whether states can actually shoulder more of the disaster response burden without adequate federal support and funding.
And then we delved into the potentially devastating consequences of defunding critical climate monitoring infrastructure, like the iconic Mauna Loa Observatory and the wider NOAA network. Losing that data could seriously cripple our ability to understand, predict, and respond to our rapidly changing planet. It impacts everything from long-term climate projections to immediate wildfire and flood warnings.
Absolutely. These shifts aren't happening in isolation. They have truly far-reaching implications for public health, for the quality of our environment, and for the resilience of individuals and communities across the entire nation.
It just underscores how vital it is for all of us to stay informed, to really try and understand these crucial issues as they continue to unfold, which leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder, doesn't it?
It does.
As our planet continues to change, perhaps at an accelerating rate, what happens to our collective ability to understand, predict, and respond when the very systems designed to monitor, regulate, and protect us are themselves undergoing such profound and potentially damaging transformation?
That's the critical question. And for listeners who want to keep digging into weather patterns, climate science, and how these kinds of changes might impact them personally, definitely make sure to follow meteorologist Rob Jones.
Where can people find him?
You can find him on Instagram. His handle is just meteorologist. He's also on TikTok at TV Meteorologist.
And over on YouTube, just search for Rob Jones Hurricane. You'll find his channel there. And that's also where you can find the playlist for this Meteorology Matters podcast. We really encourage you to explore these topics further